The autumn wind cut through Manhattan's glass towers like whispered warnings, carrying the scent of privilege and the promise of reckoning. Inside the Grand Meridian Hotel, crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors worth more than most people's yearly salaries. You're watching Hearts Unbroken, where every story whispers of dignity reclaimed. Drop a comment if you've ever felt judged by your appearance. Tonight, the hotel's grand ballroom hummed with the particular energy that only extreme wealth could generate. Champagne bubbles caught the light from hand-cut crystal glasses, each one worth more than a month's rent in most neighborhoods. Silk evening gowns rustled against mahogany chairs as socialites settled into their designated territories of influence. The air itself seemed thick with the weight of zeros, bank account balances, stock portfolios, charitable donations that doubled as tax write-offs. Gold-flecked wallpaper reflected the warm glow of Edison bulbs suspended in geometric patterns above polished mahogany tables. Each place setting featured bone china that had traveled from England in climate-controlled shipping containers, accompanied by silverware that bore the monograms of families whose names graced hospital wings and university libraries. At the head of this carefully orchestrated display of power sat Vincent Harrington, CEO of Global Tech Industries. His navy suit was tailored to perfection, each thread chosen to project authority without ostentation. But it was his eyes that truly commanded attention. Sharp, calculating, constantly measuring the room's occupants like stock prices on a ticker tape. Vincent didn't simply attend events like this, he dominated them. His laugh carried just the right note of confidence to remind everyone present of his quarterly earnings reports. When he spoke, conversations naturally gravitated toward his voice, drawn by the magnetic pull of someone who had never learned the meaning of the word no. He leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against the table's edge in a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Steady, controlled, unstoppable. To his left sat board members whose approval he no longer needed. To his right, investors whose money he'd multiplied beyond their wildest projections. Behind him, a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city's skyline, each building a testament to the kind of vision that separated leaders from followers. "Ladies and gentlemen," the evening's host announced from the podium, "tonight we celebrate not just success, but the responsibility that comes with it." Vincent's smile was precise, practiced. He'd given this same smile to congressional committees, international trade delegations, and magazine photographers. It was the smile of a man who had built an empire from nothing and intended to keep it that way. The servers moved between tables with choreographed precision, their black uniforms creating moving shadows against the golden light. Each course arrived under silver domes that were lifted simultaneously, revealing delicacies flown in from corners of the world most guests had never visited, despite their private jets. Outside, the October night pressed against the windows with unusual intensity. Streetlights created pools of amber warmth on sidewalks where a different kind of life continued. Delivery drivers racing between apartments, night shift workers catching buses, students walking home from library study sessions. But inside the Grand Meridian's protective bubble, that world might as well have existed on another planet. Here, poverty was a statistic to be addressed in quarterly philanthropy reports. Hunger was a problem solved by writing checks to organizations with respectable letterheads. Homelessness was an abstract concept discussed over 7-course meals. Vincent raised his glass as the evening's program began, the crystal catching light like a prism, breaking apart the spectrum of human experience into its component parts. Those who had, and those who did not. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. Inside, warmth and laughter and the gentle clink of prosperity. Outside, cold wind and empty streets, and the kind of silence that comes when the city's machinery temporarily pauses to catch its breath. No one in that room could have predicted that the evening's most profound moment would come, not from any speech or presentation, but from a figure they had not yet seen approaching the hotel's entrance. 3 blocks away, a trembling hand reached toward the Grand Meridian's ornate brass door handle, fingers shaking not from the cold, but from the weight of hope and terror that comes with stepping into a world that has never welcomed you. Lena Rivera's fingers traced the edges of the cream-colored invitation for the 100th time that day, the paper soft from repeated handling. The formal script seemed to mock her with its elegant curves, each letter a reminder of worlds she'd once inhabited, dreams she'd once chased. She stood beneath the hotel's awning, watching through glass doors as society's elite moved like chess pieces across the marble floor. Her reflection stared back, a woman whose appearance told only half her story. The second-hand dress she wore had been carefully pressed, its navy fabric chosen to hide stains and wear. But it was her hands that revealed the truth. Calloused fingertips from countless hours of cleaning offices after midnight, nails cut short not by choice, but by necessity. In her arms, 8-month-old Maris slept with the profound peace that only infants possess. The baby's dark lashes rested against cheeks still round with the innocence of someone who had never known judgment. A thin blanket, hand-knitted by a shelter volunteer, wrapped around her small frame, and on her tiny ankle, barely visible beneath the fabric, a delicate silver charm caught the hotel's exterior lighting. How did I get here? Lena thought, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. The invitation had arrived 3 days ago, hand-delivered by a soft-spoken woman named Maria Santos from the Community Outreach Coalition. You deserve to be seen, Maria had said, pressing the envelope into Lena's hands at the shelter. Your story matters. But standing here now, watching the careful choreography of wealth through the glass, Lena wondered if Maria had made a terrible mistake. Once, she had belonged in rooms like this, not as a guest of honor perhaps, but as someone who understood the language of academic conferences, policy discussions, and research presentations. Her mind still held fragments of that former life, dissertation notes on community development, research methodologies that could transform neighborhoods, statistical models that revealed the human cost of systemic failures. The Carter Foundation scholarship had changed everything. Or so she'd believed. Full funding for her PhD program, mentorship opportunities, connections that stretched across the social justice landscape. She'd been 24, brilliant, and convinced that education was the bridge between her childhood in East Harlem and a future where she could lift others up with her. 5 years, she thought, adjusting Maris against her shoulder. 5 years since the foundation's funding had been restructured. 5 years since her academic advisor had shrugged apologetically and suggested she reassess her priorities. 5 years since the safety net she'd trusted had simply vanished, leaving her to choose between completing her degree and keeping a roof over her head. Maris stirred, making the soft sounds that meant she would wake soon. Lena rocked gently, a motion that had become as natural as breathing. This tiny person had become her universe. Not by choice initially, but by the fierce love that had surprised her with its intensity. When Maris's father had disappeared upon learning of the pregnancy, Lena had felt the ground shift beneath her feet. When the foundation funding dried up simultaneously, that shift had become an earthquake. But Maris had also become her anchor. Each morning, those bright eyes opened with such trust, such certainty, that her mother would provide whatever was needed. That faith had kept Lena moving when everything else urged her to stop. The baby's charm bracelet shifted as she moved, revealing the small Carter Foundation emblem, a dove in flight, wings spread toward an unseen horizon. Lena had kept it despite everything, partly from sentiment, partly because it was the only physical proof of the path she'd once walked. Through the glass, she watched a server offer champagne to a woman whose diamond bracelet could have paid for a year's rent. The woman declined with a wave that suggested such gestures were routine, unremarkable. What would they see when they look at me? Lena wondered. A cautionary tale? A charity case? Or would they simply not see her at all? She thought of Maria Santos's words. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is show up exactly as we are. Maris opened her eyes, focusing on her mother's face with the kind of attention that made everything else fade. In that gaze, Lena found not pity or judgment, but recognition. You are enough, those eyes seemed to say. You have always been enough. The hotel's brass handle felt cold beneath her palm as she finally reached for it. Whatever happened beyond this threshold, she would meet it with the same dignity that had carried her through shelter lines and job rejections and nights when formula cost more than she had in her wallet. She was Lena Rivera, former scholarship recipient, current survivor, and always Maris's mother. Tonight, that would have to be enough. The door opened with surprising ease, releasing a wave of warm air scented with expensive perfume and possibility. The ballroom's warmth enveloped Lena as she stepped inside, Maris still sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. The sudden transition from cold street to heated luxury made her skin flush, but it was the weight of 100 pairs of eyes that truly made her breath catch. Conversations didn't stop. They simply shifted frequency, becoming the kind of whispered commentary that felt more cutting than open stares. Lena moved toward the registration table, each step measured and deliberate despite the tremor in her legs. Name? The hostess's smile was professional but strained, her eyes already scanning Lena's attire with practiced assessment. Lena Rivera, I have an invitation. The woman's fingers paused over her tablet. I don't see, oh here, community outreach allocation. Her tone suggested she'd found something distasteful stuck to her shoe. You'll want table 47, back section. Vincent Harrington's attention had been drifting during the evening's opening remarks when something caught his peripheral vision, movement that didn't belong. His gaze swept the room with the methodical precision of a hawk, scanning for field mice, cataloging each face until it landed on the anomaly. There. A woman who clearly didn't understand the event's caliber, holding what appeared to be an infant. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Security lapses like this reflected poorly on the entire organization. Lena found table 47 wedged between a service station and an emergency exit, close enough to hear the proceedings, but far enough to remain invisible. She settled into her chair carefully, adjusting Maris, who had begun to stir from the noise and unfamiliar surroundings. Excuse me. A security guard materialized beside her table, his voice professionally neutral. There seems to be some confusion about your seating arrangement. The conversations at nearby tables grew quieter, guests leaning forward slightly to catch the unfolding drama. Lena felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice steady. I was directed here by the hostess. Ma'am, this event requires formal attire and advanced security clearance for all attendees. His words carried across the space with uncomfortable clarity. I'm going to need to verify your invitation. Maris, disturbed by the tension in her mother's body, began to fuss, small whimpering sounds that seemed thunderous in the sudden quiet. Lena reached into her worn purse for the invitation, her hands trembling slightly as several guests turned to watch the spectacle. Vincent rose from his seat at the head table, his movement drawing attention like a magnet. He crossed the ballroom with measured steps, his expression carved from stone. Whispered conversations followed in his wake. That's Vincent Harrington, CEO of Global Tech. He doesn't usually involve himself in what seems to be the issue. Vincent's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. The security guard straightened. Sir, we have a situation with an unauthorized guest. She claims to have an invitation, but standards exist for a reason, Vincent interrupted, his gaze finally settling on Lena with cold assessment. This is a private event for industry leaders and invited dignitaries. We cannot compromise the integrity of our gathering by allowing anyone who simply appears. The words hung in the perfumed air like a verdict. Lena felt every eye in the nearby section focusing on her, felt the collective shift as the room's occupants aligned themselves with power rather than justice. No one would challenge Vincent Harrington at his own event. Maris's fussing escalated to genuine crying, her small voice cutting through the heavy silence. The sound seemed to amplify Lena's humiliation, marking her as the woman who couldn't even keep her child quiet in polite company. Please, she's just hungry, Lena whispered, rocking gently. I can step outside. That would be best, Vincent replied, his tone suggesting the matter was closed. Security will escort you to an appropriate exit. The whispers began in earnest now, a chorus of judgment disguised as concern. How did she even get in? Is that baby crying? Security should have caught this earlier. Poor thing. She clearly doesn't understand. Each comment landed like a small blade, precisely aimed at the spaces between her ribs where dignity lived. But Lena didn't break. She stood slowly, adjusting Maris against her shoulder with practiced grace. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but carried clearly across the watching crowd. "I have every right to be here. My invitation was legitimate, and I've done nothing wrong except not look the way you expected." Vincent's eyes narrowed. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand the nature of this gathering." "I understand perfectly." Lena's gaze met his without flinching. "I understand that my appearance makes you uncomfortable. I understand that you'd rather I disappear than challenge your assumptions about who deserves to be seen." The ballroom had fallen completely silent now. Even Maris's crying reduced to soft hiccups. Vincent found himself in the unfamiliar position of being publicly challenged, his authority questioned, in front of peers and subordinates. Near the back of the room, Ricardo Morales, a respected advocate for social justice causes, had been watching the exchange with growing discomfort. But as Lena shifted Maris to her other arm, something caught his attention. A glint of silver at the baby's ankle, barely visible beneath the hand-knitted blanket. His breath caught. That charm, that particular design, he'd seen it before years ago in the Carter Foundation's archives. Ricardo rose from his seat, moving closer with sudden urgency. As he did, his mind raced through possibilities, connections, the kind of recognition that changes everything. The collision was about to become something none of them could have anticipated. Ricardo Morales had spent 15 years documenting social justice initiatives across the Northeast. His eyes were trained to notice details others missed, the subtle markers that revealed hidden stories, the small symbols that connected past to present. The charm on the baby's ankle was no coincidence. He moved through the crowd with practiced discretion, his journalist's instincts fully engaged. The Carter Foundation emblem was distinctive, a dove in flight with wings that curved in a specific pattern, designed exclusively by renowned silversmith Lena Vasquez in 1987. Only direct beneficiaries and family members received them, and the foundation had been extremely selective about their distribution. "Claire," he whispered, catching the attention of investigative journalist Claire Donovan, who had been covering the gala for the Metropolitan Herald. "Do you see the baby's ankle bracelet?" Claire followed his gaze to where Lena stood near the service station, gently bouncing Maris, who had finally quieted. Claire's reputation had been built on connecting dots others couldn't see, and Ricardo's urgency immediately triggered her professional radar. "That's a Carter Foundation piece," Ricardo continued, his voice barely audible above the ambient chatter. "Those haven't been distributed in over 5 years. The foundation closed their beneficiary program after Lucinda Carter's death." Claire's eyes sharpened. She pulled out her phone, fingers moving quickly across the screen as she accessed the Herald's research database. "Carter Foundation. Beneficiary records. Let me cross-reference." Meanwhile, Vincent had returned to the podium, seemingly satisfied that the disruption had been contained. His voice boomed across the ballroom as he launched into his prepared remarks about corporate responsibility and community engagement, completely unaware that the very community he was discussing stood humiliated at the room's edge. "Tonight, we celebrate not just financial success, but our commitment to uplifting those who need our support," Vincent declared, his words carrying an irony that made several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. Lena remained where security had positioned her, near the emergency exit, holding Maris close. She felt suspended between worlds, too visible to disappear, too displaced to belong. The hostile stares had softened into uncomfortable avoidance, but the isolation cut just as deeply. Claire's research was yielding results faster than she'd expected. "Ricardo, look at this." She angled her phone screen toward him. "Lena Rivera, full scholarship recipient, 2018-2021, doctoral candidate in urban development and social policy. Funding terminated due to foundation restructuring." Ricardo's pulse quickened as he read over her shoulder. "Keep going. What about family connections?" Claire's fingers flew across the screen, pulling up archive documents, cross-referencing databases, following digital trails that most people didn't know existed. Her investigative work had taught her that the most explosive stories often hid in plain sight, protected by assumptions and social blindness. "Got something," she breathed. "Emergency contact records. Next of kin. Ricardo, this is... She stopped mid-sentence, her face pale with recognition. What is it? According to the Foundation's sealed records, Lena Rivera listed her daughter Maris as inheriting beneficiary status upon birth. But more than that, look at the maternal lineage documentation. The screen displayed a family tree that made Ricardo's breath catch. Maris Rivera, age 8 months, daughter of Lena Rivera, granddaughter of Elena Rivera Carter, direct descendant of Lucinda Carter herself. Jesus, Ricardo whispered. She's not just a former beneficiary, she's family. Across the room, Vincent continued his speech, gesturing broadly about Global Tech's partnership with various charitable organizations. We believe that every individual, regardless of their current circumstances, deserves the opportunity to rise above their station. The irony was becoming unbearable. Claire pulled out her press recorder, her mind already structuring the story that would break before the evening ended. But she needed confirmation. Needed to approach this carefully. We need to verify this with Lena directly, she told Ricardo. But if this is accurate, if that baby is Lucinda Carter's great-granddaughter, then Vincent Harrington just publicly humiliated civil rights royalty. Word was beginning to spread in whispers through the ballroom. Ricardo's discreet conversations with other advocates, Claire's phone calls to her editor, the gradual recognition among guests who remembered the Carter Foundation's legacy. Knowledge moved like electricity through the crowd, jumping from table to table in quiet conversations and meaningful glances. Vincent remained oblivious, his speech reaching its crescendo as he spoke about dignity and respect for all members of society. The disconnect between his words and his recent actions was becoming impossible to ignore. Near the emergency exit, Lena felt the shift in the room's energy without understanding its source. Conversations seemed to center around her location, though she couldn't hear the words. Maris had fallen back asleep, one tiny fist curled around her mother's finger, the silver charm catching light from the chandeliers above. The revelation was 60 seconds away from changing everything. Claire Donovan had covered enough scandals to know that timing was everything. She waited until Vincent's speech reached its most hypocritical peak, his declaration about recognizing the inherent worth of every human being, before she stood. Mr. Harrington, her voice cut through the applause with journalistic precision. Before you continue, I think this audience should know exactly you just asked security to remove. The ballroom fell silent with the kind of completeness that only comes when hundreds of people simultaneously hold their breath. Vincent's confident smile faltered, his hands gripping the podium edges as he tried to maintain control of his own event. I'm sorry, who are you to interrupt? Claire Donovan, Metropolitan Herald. She held up her press credentials, her voice carrying clearly across the marble floors. And the woman you humiliated tonight isn't just any community member. She's Lena Rivera, former Carter Foundation scholarship recipient and doctoral candidate in urban development. A ripple of recognition moved through the crowd. The Carter Foundation's reputation commanded respect in these circles. Lucinda Carter had been a legend whose work had shaped social policy for decades. Claire continued, her voice steady and professional. More importantly, the baby she's holding, the baby whose crying you found so disruptive, is Maris Rivera, the great-granddaughter of Lucinda Carter herself. The silence that followed was deafening. Vincent's face underwent a transformation visible from across the room, confidence melting into confusion, then dawning horror as the implications hit him. He had just publicly humiliated civil rights royalty at his own corporate philanthropy event. That can't be, he stammered, his usual eloquence abandoning him. The records are public, Claire announced, holding up her phone. Carter Foundation archives, cross-referenced with birth certificates and family documentation. Lena Rivera is not just a woman experiencing homelessness. She's the keeper of one of our nation's most important social justice legacies. Phones appeared throughout the ballroom like stars emerging at dusk. Videos began recording, live streams started broadcasting, hashtags began trending in real time. The story was already spreading beyond the hotel's walls, racing through social networks with the velocity that only genuine outrage could generate. Hit that like button if you believe in karma, because what happens next proves that sometimes the universe keeps perfect score. Lena stood frozen near the emergency exit, Maris still sleeping peacefully in her arms. The words were reaching her in fragments: Carter Foundation, great-granddaughter, legacy, but the full meaning felt too enormous to process. Lucinda Carter, she whispered to herself, the name that had shaped her childhood. The grandmother she'd lost touch with after family disagreements about commercializing the foundation's work. The woman whose scholarship had once represented hope, whose foundation had both lifted her up and let her fall. The silver charm on Maris's ankle suddenly felt heavy with significance. Not just a keepsake, but a birthright. Not just jewelry, but a connection to a woman who had changed the world through quiet persistence and unwavering dignity. I think, Claire continued, her journalist's instincts recognizing the perfect climactic moment, that Mr. Harrington's speech about recognizing human worth takes on new meaning when we consider that he just denied ceding to civil rights royalty because she didn't look wealthy enough. Vincent's face had gone ashen. Around him, board members whispered urgently, damage control already beginning. The philanthropic event that was supposed to showcase his company's values had become a public relations nightmare of epic proportions. I didn't know, he said, his voice barely carrying to the front tables. How could I have known? That's exactly the point, Ricardo Morales called out, standing from his table. You didn't need to know her identity to treat her with basic human dignity. The room erupted in a mixture of murmured agreements and uncomfortable silence. Social media notifications were pinging constantly now. The story had gone viral, spreading across platforms with the speed of digital wildfire. Carter granddaughter and dignity denied were already trending, accompanied by photos and videos from the gala. Lena felt the weight of every gaze in the room, but for the first time that evening, they didn't feel like judgment. They felt like recognition. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted Maris gently, and took a step forward. Not toward the exit, but toward the center of the room. What would you have done in Lena's position? Would you have found the strength to reclaim your space? My name is Lena Rivera, she said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly in the hushed ballroom. I am Lucinda Carter's granddaughter, Maris Rivera's mother, and a woman who has spent the last 5 years learning that dignity isn't something anyone can give you or take away. Vincent stared at her from the podium, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. In its place stood a man confronting the ugly reality of his own assumptions, the prejudices he'd never bothered to examine. I apologize, he said finally, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. I was wrong. But Lena was no longer looking at him. She was looking at Maris, at the silver charm that connected them to a legacy of fighting for justice, at a future that suddenly seemed full of possibilities she'd forgotten how to imagine. The revelation had changed everything. Not just for Vincent Harrington's reputation, but for a young mother's understanding of who she really was. The ballroom's atmosphere had shifted completely. What began as an evening of corporate self-congratulation had become something entirely different, a moment of public accountability that no amount of damage control could contain. Vincent remained at the podium, his prepared speech forgotten, facing a room full of peers who were rapidly calculating the social and financial cost of association with his actions. His apology, when it finally came, felt rehearsed despite being spontaneous. I want to publicly acknowledge my error in judgment, he said, his voice lacking its earlier authority. Ms. Rivera and her daughter deserve better treatment than they received tonight. But the words landed flat, corporate speak that revealed more about his concern for reputation than genuine remorse. Several board members had already stepped away from the head table, their body language suggesting emergency consultations were imminent. Dr. Margaret Chen, Global Tech's longest-serving board member, approached the microphone with the measured steps of someone accustomed to crisis management. The board will be conducting a comprehensive review of tonight's events, she announced. This incident reflects a failure of leadership that requires immediate attention. The message was clear. Vincent's position was no longer secure. Meanwhile, Lena found herself surrounded by a different kind of attention. Community advocates who had been scattered throughout the room began gravitating toward her. Not with pity, but with recognition and respect. Ricardo Morales was the first to reach her. Miss Rivera, he said gently, I've followed your grandmother's work for years. She would be proud of how you handled yourself tonight." The words hit Lena with unexpected force. For so long, she'd felt disconnected from her family's legacy, as if her circumstances had somehow disqualified her from claiming that heritage. But standing here, holding Maris while reclaiming her space in this room, she began to understand that dignity wasn't about where you lived or what you wore. It was about how you carried yourself when the world tried to diminish you. Claire Donovan approached with her recorder, but her manner was respectful, rather than intrusive. "Would you be willing to share your story? Not for sensation, but for change?" Lena looked down at Maris, who had awakened and was gazing around the room with the fearless curiosity of someone too young to understand prejudice. In those bright eyes, Lena saw reflected not just her own journey, but the future her grandmother had fought to create. "Yes," she said quietly, "but not just my story, the story of everyone who gets judged before they're seen." The media response was swift and unforgiving. Within hours, video clips of Vincent's dismissal and Lena's dignified response were trending across multiple platforms. But more importantly, the story had sparked conversations that went beyond the immediate scandal. Community organizations began reaching out, not with charity, but with opportunities. Housing advocates offered transitional programs that honored recipients' autonomy. Educational institutions extended invitations for Lena to complete her doctoral work. The Carter Foundation, under new leadership, announced the reopening of their scholarship program with Lena as an advisory board member. For Vincent, the consequences multiplied quickly. Corporate sponsors began distancing themselves from global tech. Shareholders demanded explanations at emergency meetings. The company's stock price fluctuated with each new development in the story. But perhaps the most significant change was happening within Vincent himself. Stripped of the insulating bubble of absolute authority, he was forced to confront questions he'd never bothered to ask. That night, alone in his penthouse office, he found himself researching the Carter Foundation's history, reading Lucinda Carter's speeches, trying to understand how he'd become someone who could humiliate a civil rights legacy without even recognizing it. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Decades of conditioning don't disappear overnight. But cracks had appeared in his worldview, spaces where light might eventually enter. 3 days later, Lena stood before a packed community center, Maris sleeping peacefully in a carrier against her chest. The room was filled with faces she recognized: shelter residents, community workers, students struggling to balance education with survival. "My grandmother once said that change happens not when the powerful decide to help, but when the marginalized decide to speak," Lena began, her voice steady and clear. "Tonight's events reminded me that our worth isn't determined by other people's recognition. It exists whether they see it or not." The applause that followed wasn't polite or perfunctory. It was the sound of people seeing themselves reflected in her story, understanding that transformation was possible even when the system seemed designed to prevent it. Maris stirred at the sound, opening her eyes to look up at her mother. The silver charm on her ankle caught the room's fluorescent lighting. But it was her expression, alert, engaged, unafraid, that truly caught attention. She was the future watching the present reckon with its past, a reminder that the world being shaped today would be the one she inherited tomorrow. 6 months after that transformative autumn evening, the sun streamed through the windows of the newly established Carter Community Center, casting warm light across faces gathered for the facility's grand opening. Lena Rivera stood at the podium, no longer the woman who had trembled outside the Grand Meridian Hotel, but someone who had found her voice and learned to use it. When my grandmother Lucinda Carter first began her advocacy work, Lena addressed the crowd. She believed that change happens one conversation at a time, one person at a time, one generation at a time. The audience, a mix of community leaders, former shelter residents, students, and advocates, listened with the kind of attention reserved for words that carried weight. In the front row, Maris sat in her stroller, now 14 months old, and beginning to pull herself up to standing, her bright eyes taking in everything around her. The silver charm on her ankle had become something different over these months. No longer a hidden symbol of lost connections, it now represented continuity. a bridge between the legacy of the past and the promise of the future. This center represents more than just services, Lena continued. It represents the belief that every person who walks through these doors carries potential that deserves to be recognized, nurtured, and celebrated. Behind her, floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the center's courtyard, where children played on equipment donated by local businesses. The facility offered everything from job training to childcare, from educational support to legal advocacy, all designed with the input of people who had experienced these needs firsthand. At a corner table, Vincent Harrington sat quietly, his presence notable not for the authority he once commanded, but for the humility he'd gradually developed. The past 6 months had been a journey of genuine self-examination for him. Global Tech had implemented comprehensive bias training, restructured their hiring practices, and established a community partnership fund that operated with transparency and accountability. "I spent years running from my heritage," Lena said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "Ashamed of the struggles that had knocked me off what I thought was the right path. But that night at the Grand Meridian taught me that there is no single path to purpose. Sometimes the detours teach us the most important lessons." Vincent had requested a few minutes to speak, and when Lena introduced him, he approached the microphone with none of his former swagger. "6 months ago, I made assumptions based on appearances that revealed the worst aspects of my character," he began. "Miss Rivera and her daughter taught me that leadership isn't about commanding respect, it's about earning it through actions that honor the dignity of others." His transformation wasn't complete, might never be complete, but the effort was genuine. Global Tech's new policies had created opportunities for dozens of people who previously would have been overlooked. The changes weren't just corporate responsibility, they were acknowledgement that the company had to earn back the trust it had lost. As the ceremony concluded, Lena bent down to lift Maris from her stroller. The toddler had been pulling herself up to standing more frequently, and today, surrounded by the energy of hope and possibility, she seemed ready for something new. "Come on, sweetheart," Lena whispered, setting Maris on her feet near the edge of the room's open space. Maris wobbled for a moment, her tiny hands gripping her mother's fingers. Then, with the fearless determination that only children possess, she let go and took her first independent step. Then another, and another, walking toward the sunlight streaming through the windows. The room erupted in applause, but Lena barely heard it. In that moment, watching her daughter move forward with confidence and joy, she saw the future Lucinda Carter had envisioned, a world where every child could take their first steps into possibility rather than limitation. The silver charm caught the light as Maris toddled forward, no longer just a symbol of heritage, but a promise of what was to come. In those small, determined steps, everyone present could see the continuation of a legacy that had begun with one woman's refusal to accept injustice, and now lived on in the next generation's courage to keep moving forward. "Thank you for being part of this journey," Lena said to the audience, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for believing that every story matters, every voice deserves to be heard, and every person has the right to be seen for who they truly are." That's the power of stories like these. They remind us that transformation is always possible, that dignity is a birthright, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply refuse to let others make us invisible. Subscribe to Hearts Unbroken and join our family of storytellers who believe in the power of human resilience. Share your own story of overcoming judgment in the comments below, because every voice matters, and every story has the power to change the world.